We've been looking at a class on just ordinary people. It's kind of like an extended version of the class 10 Ordinary Men to also include a mix of men and women. So as Clint announced at the end of class last time, he said next week it'll be John and Sarah, and I told him I had a bit of a flashback because Sarah was the name of my first girlfriend. So I was like, I don't know. So maybe it was meant to be. So here we go. Let's just get right into it. All right, so first of all, right off the bat, just kind of getting some thoughts going from the class. Got a good attendance today. How do you picture Sarah? And I found like this outline of a woman in kind of a burqa, right? But it's like if you walk around this woman, what do you see? What do you see from her physically? What do you think about Sarah when you think of her, I guess, like emotionally or in her interactions, her relationships? How do you guys envision Sarah? And we'll be in Genesis chapter 11 if you want to start turning there. That way I can stall.
Maybe a little frustrated.
A little frustrated? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into the reasons why very soon. Yeah.
Without questioning, she's really obedient.
Very obedient? Absolutely. Yeah. You know, when I was Googling for images for the slides, and you search for Sarah and Abraham, just like superficially, you come across someone who looks more like a grandmother, if you will, right? Someone a bit older. And again, there's reasons for that as well as we get into her background. All right, so let's get into this a little bit. And right off the bat, I'm like, I don't know if I would go with that. So your first blank in here. Honestly, there are times that Sarah comes across as a bit of a shrew. This comes from, again, the study guide. I didn't use this word. In fact, I wouldn't use this word because I don't usually use this word. I'm like, what is a shrew? Well, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that word? Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew, right? Yeah, and for me it was, this was like the Taming of the Shrew for my generation. 10 Things I Hate About You. This was like a movie that came out when I was in high school, kind of retold, modernized it. And I think Julia Stiles' face kind of says it all right there, right? She's kind of grumpy, not too happy, antisocial maybe. Google, I got to start doing this because Google defines shrew, because I hit define shrew and it doesn't say where it comes from. But a bad-tempered or aggressively assertive woman. And I mean, is it fair to label Sarah that way? It's not the first way I think about her, but certainly as we're going to see, there are a number of instances where, yeah, she kind of gets aggressively assertive for sure. Bad-tempered, yeah, there's going to be some conflict. Some of it from her own, I was going to say meddling, but that doesn't seem quite fair either. So let's see, what events make her look bad-tempered or aggressively assertive? Well, there's going to be the whole thing with Hagar. We'll get into that. She gave the idea to Abraham. Seems like she immediately regrets it, at least within the same chapter. She mistreats Hagar. She sends Hagar and Ishmael away. But again, we'll get to Hagar in a little bit. Okay, so more about Sarah's background. What does her name mean? I'm back to Shakespeare. What's in the name? Sarai, her given name, it means my princess. And that's another thing when we talk about how do you picture Sarah. Well, I mean, just physically, the scripture seems to say over and over again she's very beautiful. And her name almost kind of tries to, fit with this, princess, right? I mean, even at the age of 65, Abram is going to be worried about her beauty. Even at the age of 89, he's going to be worried about her beauty. So she is someone of immense beauty physically, supposedly. And she does have some weaknesses, and she's got some times of weakness. But as we're going to see, she also has some amazing strengths. And again, this lesson is called Hoping Against Hope. We're going to see just how long she had to persevere in hope. All right, let's get into her background a little bit. Genesis chapter 11. Starting in verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no child. Okay. All right, so what do we know about her, just again, right off the bat, from her background? Okay. Whoa. I just blew right through my nose. Don't be like that. Okay. What is going on? Okay. Let's try this again. I wonder if... All right. Don't be mean. Okay, so she's first mentioned in Genesis 11, what we just read. And she's the half-sister of Abram, her husband. This is the same father, a different mother. And I think we kind of have to do like a full stop, right? It's just like, it's starting to get a little awkward. It's a little weird. At least for us in the 21st century, that's just not an acceptable thing to do. But it's a good reminder and a good opportunity right off the bat to check our lens that we're using to view this history. You can't necessarily look at some of this history through our modern eyes, through our modern civilization. It's a totally different culture, totally different time. This is still acceptable. In fact, marrying close relatives isn't going to be outlawed until the law of Moses several hundred years later. And why is it acceptable? Well, there's a variety of different possible reasons. A lot of people, speculate that at this time the gene pool is just more pure. We started with Adam and Eve, and it hasn't gotten to the point of genetic mutations, corruptions, inbreeding, all of that stuff that royalty is going to face later on. So this isn't actually necessarily a problem.
Only 10 generations removed from Noah.
Right, that's right, where it all kind of came back together anyway, right?
Well, so we're not talking about, it's only 10 generations away from Noah.
Right, exactly. So it's still pretty much an intact gene pool, right? Exactly. Okay. This might also be a good opportunity, though, to think back on Sarah's beauty as well. And this is where I go into pure speculation. But I wonder sometimes if some of the situations we're going to be getting into in a little bit here are kind of like a Lord of the Rings kind of situation with Aragorn, right? Where in the Lord of the Rings, the main character is of a bloodline that is blessed with long life. So it might also be that there's different expectations also in the lifespan of people. Now, obviously, she's going to be too old to bear children at some point in this story. But it's not, again, when I think of, I'm going to get myself in trouble, but it's like when I think of what a 65-year-old looks like or what an 89-year-old looks like, that might not be the same as it is today. Because Sarah's going to live to 127 years old. Abraham's going to live to 175. This isn't typical for today. Isaac lives to 180. Jacob past 130. Joseph 110. It might also be that the adjustments for life expectancy were still settling in. Now, whether or not this is specific to Abraham and Sarah, or if just everyone's living to be 130 at this time, that's just all speculation anyway. But all I'm saying is let's challenge how we normally think, how we think about people today. Let's not necessarily apply that to what was going on back then. And I think it's a challenge when you look at the early chapters of Genesis, but well, here we are. Okay, so what else do we know about Sarah? Well, she's barren. This is like her introduction, she's married to Abram and she's barren. She has no child. Okay, so not a lot said in the introduction, but why is this important? Well, it's going to be important for the promise, but I think we also understand how important it was to bear children in the ancient world. I mean, you were looking for heirs. You were looking for a lineage. I mean, this is not just going to be something unique to Sarah. Rachel is going to struggle with this in a few chapters. You can think also of Samuel's mom, Elkanah's wife, in 1 Samuel. It's a difficult thing to be a barren woman in an ancient culture. There was a big focus on fertility. Yes, Adam?
There's no 401ks, there's no stock market, there's no retirement plans, and your children are the people that take care of you in your old age.
Yeah.
To be barren means to be alone in your old age.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. As Adam pointed out, there's no retirement plan, so your children are an important part of that when you grow older. Very good. Okay, so besides that, Scripture tells us virtually nothing about their early years. When we pick up this story, as we'll see in a little bit, she's already 65 years old. So they lived in a land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and this is a very sophisticated urban culture. This is in the land of modern-day Iraq. We'll have a picture up here in a second. But it's very much in the middle of ancient civilization. We sometimes think of Abraham and Sarah as like nomads or Bedouins, sojourners, but they didn't really start traveling until later in life. Maybe midlife in their case. I don't know if it's not really a midlife crisis at 65, but again, you adjust the way you think about things on these time frames. So as we'll see, though, Sarah had an obvious role in God's plan to make Abram a great nation. Now, in your worksheets, it doesn't have that question mark. I put that question mark in there because I'm asking myself, it's obvious to who, right? The study guy said, it's obvious. Well, it was obvious to God that this is what he had intended. As we'll get into it a little bit, I'm not so sure it was obvious to Sarah. Right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about her journey to the land of promise. Here's a map here. It's in kilometers, sorry. That's for the rest of the world, I suppose. So they set out from Ur, which again, it's down by the Persian Gulf. Babylon's up here, so these are obviously important centers of urban culture at this time. They go over to Haran and then down into Canaan. Now, what's interesting about this is, let's take a look at the end of chapter 11 here. It says, Terah told Abram his son, this is verse 31 of chapter 11. Terah told Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Let me go into chapter 12 for a second. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions. Okay, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. All right, so this is a journey in total of over 1,000 miles. That's something that I couldn't even imagine that much time like on the move, right? To us, 1,000 miles is still like a long day's drive. To them, this is going to like turn into a way of life for several weeks, months. So this is an interesting thought too. Abram's father traveled with them. Now this is where I start, I guess I've already started. I start diverging and asking interesting questions with the study guide because it says that Abram's father kind of starts out as the leader here. So here's the question. When they left from Ur to go up to Haran, was this the first leg of the trip that God had called Abram on, or does the call start in Haran? Now again, this might be getting just more into technical details, but chronologically, as we're reading this, I suppose you could say, not chronologically, but as the narrative's told, Abram's called at the beginning of chapter 12. Terah and his family leaves to go to Haran at the end of chapter 11. Now, this is again going to be speculation. It could be that they wanted to tell the entire story of Terah in one section. They're talking about the generations of Terah in verse 27, in which case it made sense that he was called out of Ur, and they all kind of traveled together to Haran. Or it could be that he received the call in Haran. Honestly, it doesn't necessarily matter. I just thought it was interesting that the study guide calls out that this journey started with Terah as well. Either way, it's a long way to go from what they knew. And then at this time, it's also interesting to note, Sarah's 65 years old. So Abram is 75 years old when they leave from Haran to go to Canaan. And we know that he's got about 10 years on Sarah, as we're going to see later on. And we think about, again, in our modern mind, 65 sounds like a great age for retirement, right? But it almost seems like these guys are just getting started, or maybe, again, just hitting midlife. It's a completely different set of expectations. And Sarah's going to be facing a long and difficult road of sojourning, and it's going to be different than what she has known before growing up in Ur, living in Haran. So they travel 350 miles from Haran down to Canaan. This is going to take about 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, again, it's life on the road. Okay, so great. They're in Canaan. They're where God wants them to be now, right? So everything's going to be perfect for them. Not really. Right off the bat, they get to Canaan, and there's a famine. And you can only imagine what this must do to your faith. But you're told to go somewhere, you get there, and it's like, well, great, this is you talk about barren. This is a barren place, right? This doesn't seem so great. So what do they have to do? They have to go down to Egypt to find some food. And in chapter 12, not long thereafter, we're going to read about a scandal involving Sarah and Pharaoh. Check out chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. So this isn't just your garden variety famine, it's a severe one. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. So this wasn't just Abram, being kind to his wife. She was really beautiful, right? And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Okay. So he decides to call her his sister instead of his wife. And he reasons, as we see later with Abimelech, this isn't really a lie. It's kind of like a half-truth. But it's certainly not a good idea, right? Still, through all this, Sarah remains devoted to her husband. I kind of take this one a bit personally, because I know that there's been times where I've made some real, bonehead decisions, and Rebecca hasn't, whacked me over the head, and I kind of wish she would have when I look back at some of those. But we see right off the bat that Sarah she is devoted, she's committed, she's not going to whap him over the head, although it seems like she should have. And certainly this is, again, a bit of a crisis of faith for Abram. I'm always fascinated by this story and the one with Abimelech, because he goes, hey, look, the Egyptians are going to kill me. And he forgets that God has promised to him that he's going to make a great nation out of him. So Abram's going through a difficult time with his faith as well. We're going to look at her devotion. It's going to be a constant theme throughout this, and we're going to see that she's praised for that at the end of this lesson in 1 Peter 3. Nate?
Well, I think it's also speculation, but you don't see God say, go down to Egypt since the famine is severe. There is no mention of that, so Abram might have taken his own initiative to go down there.
Yeah, you got a good point.
He's already doubting God, and he's going somewhere that he thinks he can find him.
And if this is their own initiative, it's not going to be the only time that they're going to start working on their own initiative, right? That's going to be a problem for them. Yep.
Obviously, historically, you haven't seen God do the kind of things we're used to seeing with Moses and the Exodus. He's told Abram to go down to the land of Canaan, but
Right.
do we know if this God's going to take care of us? He's told us to go someplace, but does his power only last or only effective in Canaan? Like, there's not this history of God taking care of his people, and so Abraham's still in this place where he's fending for himself, but doesn't have that faith in God.
Yeah, you got a good point. Many of the miracles that like Moses and Joshua are going to say, remind the people of when he led you out of Egypt. Well, that hasn't happened yet, right? And you haven't seen any of that, and it's been, like you said, 10 generations since Noah. So maybe, again, it's easy to be hard on them and go, well, they totally didn't have the same, kind of faith that we would expect them to have, but why would they expect to have that? It's a good point. Yep. Okay, but it's also interesting to note that, like a lot of things, God's able to work with this mess. He's able to work with a messy situation and turn it around for his purposes. Pharaoh's favor towards Sarah made Abraham a wealthy man. As we just read, they got livestock, they got servants. Interestingly enough, the servants are going to come up again too, one in particular, right? It's a little bit of foreshadowing. Okay, so let's talk about, during these years, how Sarah was yearning for this promise, blessing of a great nation. There's every reason to believe that Abram is upfront with his wife about what God was spoken to him, about the promises that God's given to him. Clearly, she knows about them, as we'll see with Hagar. But God's promise must have been a major motivator for her. To leave everything that she knew, again, part of her devotion, it seems like she was just as committed to this idea of the promises that God had given Abram as Abram was. And this wasn't a one-time promise either. Throughout the years, God's going to give her more reasons to hope. And we can even just take a look at what just happened, right? God saw them safely out of Egypt. God's going to keep Abram safe when he rescues Lot, when there's a battle of, I was going to say the 5 kings in a couple chapters. And God's also going to renew his covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. So this wasn't like a one-time thing. There's still reasons to hope. Yes, Clint.
Just kind of, backpedaling a little bit.
Please.
Before we get to Hagar, you
Yep.
think of what you just said, that surely Abram has shared with her, she knows about this promise.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, it is kind of a presumption to make, or an assumption, I guess, to make that she assumes it's through her. And maybe she does think, but over time, God keeps giving her these little nuggets of hope. But at some point, as we see when she gets to Hagar, she's got to be doing this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we're going to promise. That's why we left Haran. That's why we moved this way. Okay, when? When is this going to happen?
Yeah.
You kind of, I guess, I don't really think of that much, but I never thought of it that way. She's got to get to a point of kind of desperation where I thought this promise was to you and me.
Yeah.
Maybe it's to you and whoever we can figure out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we're getting on to, it's just a turn of the page in our Bible, but it's been like 10 years. We're getting on to 10 years now. And how many of us are patient enough for 10 years? It seems like I can't even get a 5-year plan together. Right? So you can absolutely sympathize with her. I also thought of this. I don't like, oh yes, right. The promises were made to Abram, not to Sarah directly yet. We're going to get to that in a little bit. I didn't like The Last Jedi. As far as the Star Wars movie goes. But the line that came to my mind is when Rey in The Last Jedi, she goes, I need someone to show me my place in all this. You have to wonder if that's kind of Sarah's feeling too. Like, what's my job here? Am I supposed to be part of this promise or not? And now I'm mad at myself for using The Last Jedi. All right, let's keep going. All right, so it's time to get into what we'll refer to as the Hagar incident. Sounds like some formal, diplomatic problem or something, She's going to come up with the plan. And, okay. All right, this is totally off topic. Well, not totally. But I was searching for a picture for this slide. And a lot of them aren't really appropriate for Sunday morning. They get a little too Renaissance-y, if you will, if you know what I mean. But I found this one. And this just cracks me up because it looks like Sarah is presenting Queen Victoria to produce an heir or something. And it looks like it's supposed to be engraved for the back of the $20 bill or something. I don't know. But anyway, back to the story. It's still my favorite one now. From a human viewpoint, we can understand Sarah's despair. Yeah, absolutely. It's been about 10 years now. In this episode, it's presented as a classic case of trying to solve things ourselves instead of relying on God. One of the cliches, the great verses that aren't in the Bible that we wish were in the Bible is let go and let God, right? And this is one of those typical, it's held up as a case study in not letting go and not giving it over to God. But again, can we really blame her? Sure we can, but we probably shouldn't, right? Now this is pure speculation as well. But you almost have to wonder, it's like, okay, wait, God gave, this is an Egyptian slave, by the way. It'd be very tempting to say, God gave us this blessing when we were in Egypt. Is this what he had in mind, right? You can almost wonder if some of those cogs were kind of turning in her head. All right, now this is the first recorded case of polygamy involving a righteous man. Obviously, it happened much earlier with Lamech in Genesis chapter 5, but he wasn't really held up as an example of a good guy. He's kind of on the Cain side of things. And I think it's clear to say that it was never God's plan. I mean, when Jesus talks about the plan of marriage, in the New Testament, he's talking about divorce, and he's like, it wasn't ever supposed to be like that either, right? He says in the beginning it was supposed to be a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. And this is right off the bat, it's going to cause problems. And it's interesting because I think God permits it in this case, but it's another one of those situations where it doesn't seem like it's ideal. And polygamy is going to obviously cause problems for people later on down the line in the Old Testament. It's going to be a problem for David. It's going to be a problem for Solomon. It's going to be a problem for Abraham and Jacob as well. I was going to say Isaac, but not that one. They skipped a generation. It is interesting to note also, though, that the scripture is very clear. Let's take a look at this. In Genesis chapter 16, he gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. It's very clear that sexual relations still implied marriage. This isn't a concubine kind of situation. That's interesting to note, too. So Abraham should have rejected Sarah's plan. I keep struggling with which name to use because it hasn't really changed yet. It's easy for us to say now, today, right? I mean, hindsight, the Monday morning quarterback, right? Armchair quarterback. He went along with this. I mean, you have to ask yourself why. Well, if he was convinced that it was supposed to be Sarah's job to be the mom, he probably would have rejected this, right? So it's easy, again, to kind of just throw all this on Sarah, but Abram, he's not sure either.
Well, it's interesting, too, that God's still new to them. I mean, they come from and they come from Haran, where there's all kinds of gods, and the idea of a regional God.
Right.
And they're just really kind of getting to know Jehovah God. So, I mean, I guess it's easy to be super judgmental of them, but it's like, they don't know what to expect exactly. They're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And they're taking things in their own hands. But.
Right. And I've always thought this was interesting, too. In Joshua 24, it says that long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. So you're right. God's new to them. They were being called out of what they knew. Now, it's interesting to think about how that happened. Maybe it was just, the calling was that first moment. Yeah. Okay, so again, though, we can see that Sarah's faith at this point is resting in God's promises made to Abraham, but not her. She's still not exactly sure of her place in all of this. Now, there's much more that's going to happen because of Sarah and Hagar. And if we have time, which we probably won't, we can take a look at that at the very end. But it will cause issues, and it causes issues right off the bat, as we could see. But let's kind of skip forward a little bit. Let's get to, I guess, the rest of the story, if it's Paul Harvey, right? Or the happy ending, her joy after her perseverance. So let's fast forward to Genesis 17 in our Bibles. The covenant is renewed once again, but Sarah is now 89 years old when this promise is renewed. And the scriptures also, Sarah's pretty obvious about it. She's, postmenopausal at this point. She's not expecting to have children, and it would take something miraculous to make that happen. So about this covenant's renewal, God's now changing their names. He changes Abram's name to Abraham. Abram meaning father, and Abraham meaning father of a multitude, or exalted father. And God establishes a covenant of circumcision with Abraham. But let's take a look at verse 15 of chapter 17. Because God is now going to confirm Sarah's role for the first time. Verse 15. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall no longer call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Abraham's not even on board with this, right? He's ready. I got Ishmael here. Let's just go with that. But God's emphatic. He says, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Okay, so God is going to change Sarai's name to Sarah. This goes from just my princess to drop the my and princess. But it seems to denote that she has a broader role now in this idea of being the mother of nations, if you will. Okay, so it's been about 25 years since Abram's first calling, since the promise was first given to them. It's taken 25 years for God to confirm Sarah's role. And I think we have to ask ourselves, and maybe this is again just going to be speculation, but why? Why didn't God in chapter 12 say, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to bless Sarai with the son? Thoughts? We honestly don't know. But what do you think? Is there something that we could learn from this?
Maybe it's God's view of marriage, that there's no separation between the man and the wife. That the separation comes when we view marriage. Because if God made the promise to Abraham, it seems like he's implied it to Sarah, but it's the human weakness in the understanding of marriage and this coupling that God has to 25 years later be explicit and say this is for Abraham and his son.
Yeah, that's really a cool idea. If Abram and Sarai are one flesh, if he's referring to Abram, he's referring to Sarai. It's implied. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it does seem like we should trust. It seems like the point is we should trust in God's purposes, in God's intent for things like marriage, and we should trust in His timing. And you could say maybe until you hear differently, right? It's again, it's so easy for me to say, oh, you wait for God. 25 years, that's a long time to be considering these things and waiting. Other thoughts? Okay, so after this in Genesis chapter 18, we're going to read about a very special visit. It's a visit from the Lord. Genesis 18:1, it says, and the Lord. And this is the small caps in my Bible, right? The YHWH, Yahweh. This is, again, a very special visit. This might be one of those instances with the pre-incarnate Christ. I just think that's kind of interesting, but it's not referred to as an angel. It's referred to as the Lord, right? The Lord appeared to Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre, and he sat at the door of his tent, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Okay, so we'll fast forward a little bit. They provide some food from them, and verse 9. Okay, they said to him, where is Sarah your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. Then the Lord said, verse 10, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, they were advanced in years. The way of woman had ceased to be with Sarah, so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh. For she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. Okay, so yeah, here's kind of an image of that, right? She's overhearing what they're talking about, and she laughs at the idea. Okay, here's what the study guide has. Maybe her laughter was joy and not doubt. I tacked on a couple of extra question marks in there. John MacArthur, the author of the study guide, is pretty well convinced that this couldn't be a moment of doubt. Why? Well, she shows up in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11:11 says, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. All right, I got to get on my soapbox here for a little bit, because I think this totally misses the mark to try to excuse her laughter away and say, well, she's actually just happy. That's why she's laughing. There's nothing in the text that suggests that. In fact, God is saying in verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? He didn't say in verse 14, boy, I'm glad Sarah is happy enough to laugh about this, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense. I think it's tempting sometimes to hold up the people in Hebrews chapter 11 or the rest of the Bible as just paragons of faith, perfect examples of faith. They weren't. They were real people just like us. And I find that actually really encouraging, because it means that we can still struggle with things and at the end of the day be found faithful, right? Yeah.
I kind of find it weird that they didn't make a big deal about Abram
Yeah, that's a good point. Why is the deal made about Sarah laughing? And maybe, again, that suggests that there was a break in communication, that, again, this shouldn't be the first time, even at this age, that Sarah hears about this. Did Abraham tell Sarah, hey, they renewed the covenant, and God made it pretty clear, it's you. It's going to be you this time. Maybe this suggests that this was a new idea to her, that she actually hadn't heard this one from Abraham. There's a thought here and then back here. What?
You know, this whole thing with MacArthur, you know, I'd never heard that before either. But you look at chapter 21, verse 6, Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me.
Yep.
And she named Isaac Laughter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she seems to celebrate that, and that doesn't seem like you would celebrate. Well, I doubted, and God made me doubt.
Yeah, you got a good point.
I mean, like I said,
A little bit of credence to it?
Yeah, I've never really taken it that way. I mean, we've always studied it as her laughter is scornful and it's doubting. But like I said, Abraham doesn't, or Abram, whatever his name was then,
Abraham.
doesn't get the same degree of harassment for laughing. So, I mean, I think there's at least some
hint.
there that could
Yeah.
say, maybe it's just like, wow, it is going to happen after all.
Yeah.
And they just laugh because that's it. Chapter 21, she celebrates her laughter.
That's a good point. Yep. Yeah, so we can go on a little bit. Oh no, I can't go on. I got another year involved. Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting, kind of going back to her point about, on 1811 when it
Mhm.
says that the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah.
Sure.
And you think about it, because back in that culture, a lot of women's hygienic things were kept very secretive. Women wouldn't leave their house during that period of time and different things. And so maybe Abraham didn't quite understand that, and she did more because she had gone through basically menopause and stuff. So, I mean, I can imagine, we always joke about whenever my parents they talk to you guys about something, we're like, Mom's pregnant, obviously she can't be, but just kind of like a humorous thought.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of comes to my mind too, because she understood more
About
her
where
body
she was
and
at.
stuff, and she's like, yeah, okay, kind of a thing.
Yeah. That's an interesting point. Yeah. Let's see if we can kind of put a little bit of a bow on this. So it is interesting that, though, this is still going to be a busy year for them before Isaac is born. There's a lot going on here. Right up after this story, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. And that is another one of those must have rocked your world, like, physically kind of moments, because they actually take off and they go down to the Southland, to the Negev. Abraham and Sarah do. And then got another scandal, this time with Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20. And you're kind of, again, like, I don't know, it's kind of like a facepalm kind of moment again. It's like, again? I mean, really? But it's still interesting to note, at 89, Sarah is still found to be, very attractive by the king of the land. But finally, they have the child. Abraham names his son Isaac, meaning laughter. It says in the study guide that Sarah named it. When we look back at this again, in chapter 18, who names the child? Chapter 17, it was God that names the child. Chapter 17, verse 19, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. So it's actually God that pulls out the idea of this laughter. And they roll with it, if you will.
He's named that after Abraham laughs, not after Sarah laughs.
Yeah, he's named, and it says down here in the footnote of my Bible, Isaac means he laughs, not she laughs. So, I don't know. Interesting. And maybe there wasn't really a distinction in the name, but let's wrap this up a little bit. It's done. Thanks, PowerPoint. There's such a thing as word rage. There's also such a thing as PowerPoint rage. Come on, get in. Yeah. Here we go. So Sarah is pictured as the epitome. Oh, I got it now. That took me a second. The epitome of all faithful women in the New Testament. Here's what Peter has to say about Sarah. 1 Peter 3, 4 through 6. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Which, again, we don't necessarily always think of Sarah in that light. Which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Okay. Any last thoughts? We just ran out of time. Yes.
Just, it looks to me like, I know there was two different point of views on why she laughed,
Yeah.
but it really feels like she laughed because I'm too old. I mean, come on. Because if you look down in verse 15, or in verse 14, it says, is anything too hard for the Lord?
Right.
And at the appointed time return to you. About this next year, Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh.
Right. Because she's afraid.
Afraid.
Why would you be afraid if you were happy?
But yeah, if she was happy, she wouldn't be afraid.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, earlier you were talking about why 25 years later. The thing of it is, it wouldn't have been uncommon for her to have a child 25 years earlier. Now
It is.
definitely God working.
Yeah. That's a good point. There's no doubt at this time that this is a miracle, right? There's just no doubt at all. Very good. Yeah. So I think the other way is an interesting thought to think that it was out of joy, but I think it's a stretch. So, okay. Thanks. Appreciate all the comments today.